Welcome to another episode of the Peak Performance Selling Podcast, where we interview top sellers and sales leaders to learn the different tips, tricks, and mental strategies that they use to create sustainable peak performance. Let's get rolling. Welcome to today's episode of the Peak Performance Selling Podcast. Today, we've got a really interesting guest, Dr. Devan Kronisch, who walks the line between educator, psychologist, and enabler. Throughout their decade in academia, they became known as the go-to expert on all things diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI, while at the same time teaching inside and outside the classroom. They've developed and held everything from workshops to month-long courses, always with an eye on the well-being of their students. At Proposify now, they again combine these skills as head of the Sales Academy and leader of the DEI committee. As somebody that has many years of experience in research and psychology and scientific approach to how we work as humans, I am so fascinated and excited to have Devan share their story with us. Welcome.
Thanks for having me, Jordan.
I got a chance to hear you talk about burnout in sales a couple of weeks ago and the psychology about how folks operate. So we're going to have a lot of great stuff to unpack here. Can you start talking to us a little bit about how you ended up in a sales and sales enablement role in a tech company after spending a bunch of time in academia?
To be completely honest, I never thought I'd be in sales. Now, of course, like probably everybody else on the planet, I did have my undergrad's late teenage sales role. Fun fact about that, I did kind of improve the sales rate on that little tourist booth at the harbor by about 200% because I went in there and ran the psychology over it. And that at this point is something like 10 years ago. So when my agent came to me and, hey, Proposify needs a sales enabler, my first thing is, what on earth is a sales enabler? So I went on Google, looked it up, and was going, wait a moment, they need somebody to teach people things, to coach people, to go in there, do assessments. I can do all of that. I just have no clue about sales, so I can learn that.
That is amazing. Can you give us some of the background on where you've spent your years prior to hopping into SaaS-based tech sales organization?
A little bit all over the place, to be honest. I moved to Halifax and thereby Proposify basically a month after I got my doctorate in psychology over in Victoria. And before that, I was in Prince George, also BC, ended up in the tiniest little, hick city, let's be nice to it here, after I was in Norway, where I got my master's degree and actually my bachelor too. And throughout that entire time, I've also been working very much with nonprofit organizations. So I've been doing a lot of workshop facilitation, education, and without actually knowing that that's what it is, life coaching. So I've had people from all walks of life, from asylum seekers, refugees that needed support on the full spectrum, from mental well-being to how do I actually survive now, to people in academia that were feeling burnt out, didn't know to go with their jobs, to students that were finding out very important things about themselves and going, oh my God, I need some help with this. And now this kind of has followed me into my job, where over the last year, on top of doing the standard things, quote unquote, that we do in sales enablement, managers have kind of started coming, oh, wait a moment, isn't that somebody who's done work in leadership education before? Maybe we should ask Devan. And then, of course, I started that job only 2 months before we did see the big Black Lives Matter movement going. And as every company in North America, we were sitting there, okay, what do we do now? And they realized, hey, they have somebody on staff who's been a facilitator for difficult conversations. So freshly 2 months into my job, I'm standing in front of the entire company talking to everybody through this. And then I decided, okay, we do need a DEI committee, and started that up right away too. So, I mean, it took me 2 months to do that again. I'm getting rusty, I swear.
What is one of your big learnings from doing a lot of work in DEI and supporting that in companies that other folks can learn from? I think it's a huge topic and something that I feel pretty ignorant about in many cases as a straight cis white guy. Help us understand how can we facilitate that within organizations? How can we do that as leaders in companies and of teams to really create an open space for diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging for folks?
The belonging part is the most important thing. I do very often see that the heavy focus is on diversity. And then we end up working with HR, trying to get more diverse hires in, but then you leave after a short time because we haven't actually made an environment where people feel included and feel valued. And this is where you really, really lose out, just from a business perspective even, because if you look at the research, diversity is an incredible driver of creativity. You will not get better problem solving than if you have a diverse team. But for that diverse team to actually bring all of that to the table, there needs to be psychological safety at that table. And I know psychological safety is one of those bloody buzzwords right now, where people always going, but my accountability, what can I do about it? If you can't hold people accountable, you don't actually have psychological safety. What psychological safety is all about is a charitable disposition towards the people at the table. If somebody screws up and says something that's super offensive, your first reaction needs to be a benevolent. They didn't mean it in a malicious way, or they failed at something. Oh, there are extenuating circumstances here. It's a little bit of a trust feeling. You want people to feel safe to fall on their face. You don't want them to feel comfortable not doing anything.
Interesting. I think from what I hear there, it's this culture that's created internally about the ability to know you might screw something up and to know that you're going to get called out on it if you do. And that is an opportunity to learn and to grow, because many of us are learning through this time about how do we show up, how do we support every human on the planet, and how do we create this sense of belonging that gives us the ability to show up fully. I talk to a lot of people about masks and how many of us wear a mask or project a mask on the outside, but have totally different feelings on the inside. Mm-hmm. And if people can't feel the ability to show up authentically or fully, it's going to hurt performance. And I also find it's one of the key drivers towards burnout. And I'd love to hear some of your thoughts about, what drives burnout in organizations. What are some of those big drivers? What have you seen from the research? And what are some of the ways to help support our teams and to prevent burnout, or ideally set up a foundation for people to avoid burnout more effectively?
Oh, did you ever throw me the biggest question on the planet? Not so much in the sense of there's no way to get there, but that it is so multifaceted, because burnout comes from a lot of different factors. But we do know that the big ones are unfair treatment, unmanageable workload, lack of role clarity, lack of communication and support, and unreasonable time pressure. And that already sounds all a little bit on, okay, those are task-sided things. But there's then also the whole different category of small recurring issues. Micro-stressor is essentially where we do know that burnout comes from energy spent. And energy is one of these things that people think is just that, I'm doing some hard work, I'm creating something, I'm making a lot of decisions. There's so much stuff going on nonstop that goes on top of that. Emotions take a whole lot of energy. We've probably all known that over the last year with the pandemic. Why are we all so tired? Because in the back of your head, you're constantly processing how much risk am I right now? What's going on with my family, with my friends? How safe is my position? All of these things actually take energy. Just pushing them away also takes energy. And if you then are in a position at work where you on top of that have to spend energy and emotions to not show some things because you're not safe, then guess what? You can't perform. You are going to be burned out super quickly. And we just got the newest data in from the World Health Organizations that 55-hour weeks will essentially kill you. And I'm always sitting there, great, we're back to those 55 hours that we've also seen is the absolute maximum you have for performance. But people go in there, 55 hours, just that I stay at work. Do you go home and are completely done with anything that could be considered work? Do you need to make decisions at home? Do you have housework to help with? Kids do you have to help with? All of that is work. And people treat it as if, oh no, work is only what I do at my 9 to 5 while I sell something. Well, you're also going to sell decisions to your partner, sell your kids on it's a good thing to take a nap now. And all of these added on things that we so easily forget. And that is where burnout comes from in so many ways that we don't actually see how much energy goes into all kinds of things, where we think as long as we spend only so and so long at work, it's going to be fine. 10 minutes of your day that are incredibly stressful can be enough for some people to burn out. And to just bring the numbers in here, slight difference between Canada and the US, 75% of the workforce in the US is teetering on burnout, 50% in Canada.
Oh, that's terrifying.
Slightly.
I think that's one of the big reasons that has led me to start my company, to start helping folks think about the programming that they have for themselves to find what does fill them up, what drains them, how can they build more self-awareness and personal empathy, because that should also help us empathize with others. But with all of these pieces around burnout, I know we talked a little bit earlier about how managers and how internal teams can really support their organization to prevent burnout. Talk to me a little bit about the impact your manager, your direct leader has on your mental well-being, and what are some things that those leaders can do to really help their team survive, beyond even just survive, and actually thrive through change and transition?
Well, the first thing I want to point out is to every single sales leader, manager that's listening right now, you actually are the most important person for your direct report. You are the wall between them, burnout, bad mental well-being, and even death. I know this sounds really dramatic right now here, but we do know that a bad manager increases the chances of a heart attack at work directly. Plus, 50% of all turnover is based on the managers. So people do quit bad managers before they quit bad jobs. What can be done around that? Point number one is really that managers need to be up and in there. We are out of the century where managers could just be a taskmaster. What managers these days are doing is vision setting, is holistic well-being coaching, is essentially, once you're in a manager position, you need to role model well-being, and you need to actually ask your reports about it. And one of the things I see so often is do as I say, not as I do attitude, where managers, often because HR slapped them on the fingers, keep saying, take your vacation days. I know we're in a pandemic. I know you can't go to the Maldives or wherever you want to go. And then they never take a day off, or they show up sick to work. And all of these things play into the mindset and culture that we have. Now, I'm from Europe. I have a slightly different background, so it stands really out to me in North America. and especially in the US, where we do see that the work ethic is still to this day actually based in a Calvinist system. And a lot of folks have forgotten about this. The reason in Calvinism why you are supposed to essentially work yourself to death is to show that you will go to heaven. And it's still in. You show you're a good person by overworking. And it has become such a badge of honor where we're seeing all these tweets. Hey, it's only Wednesday and I've already worked 80 hours this week. And then we're supposed to celebrate this. And I'm just sitting here as a psychologist and going, this is the road to going from 75% of the workforce is burned out to 100% of the workforce being burned out. So no, we do need managers to role model to, I'm taking a week off, I'm taking a mental health day, I'm sick, I'm staying in. Also completely unplug when they're on vacation. I'm telling the managers that I'm coaching, I want to see stupid vacation pictures from you. I want you to go into your team Slack and send a picture of you on your veranda with the kid, with the dog, with whatever, so that it really shows it's okay to really take off, that it isn't a badge of honor to work long. We don't want people to work long. We want people to work well. What on earth does it help anybody if they're sitting on their asses for 8 hours in front of their home office PC, doing the worst possible work, and then rewarding these people for it when you have somebody else who works maybe 6 hours a day, gets everything done, and then they're sitting there for 2 hours. Well, I better find something else, or the boss is going to hit me over the head for it. The entire mindset is backwards.
Oh, there is so much fantastic meat in there, and it's so true. I think I've seen most managers that really struggle to take the time off for themselves, and so much of our learning, and I'm sure you can school me on this further, so much of our learning as humans is mimicking what we've seen and modeling after what we have seen. And so if that manager, if that leader doesn't take time or never gives themselves the space, well, we feel if we ever want to elevate or move into that role, we have to operate that same way. And I'm curious, what type of pushback are you getting from the managers that you're coaching, or what are they struggling with in those areas?
The interesting part is that with COVID, I do see a shift. There is way less pushback than there was only just a while ago, but they agree with me. They even are so happy to hear somebody else reaffirm it. And then the next month, I again see them do the same thing. So it's really breaking the habit. That's so hard for them. But what I'm also seeing is insecurity. There's an incredible amount of internalized fear of being ostracized, which is pretty much the base human fear. We are a social species. We have evolved we want to belong. We want to be part of a group. And if we've set up a culture where working hard, working long is how you show that, yes, I'm good for the group, then you don't want to be that one person sticking out. So it's very much I often need to go first because I'm proudly the person trying to work the least possible amount of hours. And I'm also the person who can every time show off, by the way, this is everything I did last week. Anybody having complaints? No? See, what have you gotten done last week? And then I go over it with them, go over the timetable, go over all the mistakes they do in their time management. And then they're sometimes sitting there, well, okay, fine. Because to learn, we often need to hurt. It's called cognitive dissonance in psychology, where we see a difference between our attitude and our behavior, and one or the other has to give. Generally speaking, it's a lot easier to change the behavior. And then once you do the behavior over and over, something in your brain is going, well, but that behavior doesn't fit together with my attitude. Oh, I guess my attitude is wrong. Boom! Now you've learned something.
Very, very interesting. And we talked a little bit before about failure and this balance around, what is an optimal level of failure to get the most learning, to perform at our best. And I'd love to hear some of your thoughts on the research you've seen there. As I think you first have to adopt a growth mindset and know that failing is okay. And that's how you learn. But how much failure is right? And it sounds like you've got some really interesting insight there. So talk to us a little bit about that optimal level of failure.
Oh, yeah. That's one of those topics that I find a lot of people are terrified of, because we've always been told that you shouldn't fail. The problem is, if you 100% of the time get it right, if you never fail, you are actually under-challenging in yourself. You are stagnating, and you are shortcutting your own creativity. Because what we do know is that we learn best in a failure-tolerant environment. If you are in a job or a position or whatever that allows you to experiment, often fall on your face, get up from it, you will go further. Now, how often do you want to fail during that? The statistical optimum is 15% of the time. If of whatever you do, you fail 15% of the time, that is top performance. Not 100%, yes, 85%. That's where you want to be.
Really, really interesting there, because we talked a little bit internally, and I talk with a lot of folks about goal setting, and that I think it's companies like Facebook say if they hit more than 50% of the goals they've set, they haven't set them high enough. And thinking about, well, do I set goals at a corporate level that are 100% attainable or not? And then thinking about my personal goals, how can folks really leverage the psychology and the research that's coming out to manage both personal goals and then corporate goals? And you can break those into two parts.
Put this in an absolute nutshell, do not use the same rules for the two of them. Corporate goals, stretch goals are great, because this is the pressure that we want. That's exactly where those 15% of failing come in. If you set your goals higher than they're easily attainable, then yes, you will get that failure rate. You will learn. You get the creativity out of it. You get that little bit of pressure that you need, as long as it's a very, very staunchly accepted fact within the company that you are going to fail. You're not going to hit those 100%. But if you hit 70% of it, holy shit, did you go far from here? This is what we want to see. But here's the big caveat. Do not use the same metric for your direct reports. This is the easiest way for people to stop being motivated towards a goal. If somebody knows that a goal is not attainable for them, your brain will do absolutely everything to sabotage itself on the, well, if I can't hit this anyway, why should I spend effort towards this? So, completely different thing. If you want to set a good goal for your employees, and you should be doing this, preferably with a fully drawn out map. There are things out there, otherwise I can also provide them if you absolutely need them. You want your goals to be clear and specific, challenging but not too difficult, meaningful, big one, meaning. Nobody gets motivated by the parental saying, why do I need to do this? Because I told you to. Not gonna work. Needs to have meaning behind it. There also needs to be feedback. Am I actually getting somewhere here? Is this the right direction? If you don't have that feedback, you don't know where on your goal you even are, which means you need to have some kind of defined measure. And it's fine if those are qualitative. Anecdotal, of course, has its drawbacks, but if this is the only measure you can come up with, have another person there who also tells you if you go in the right direction. And then the part that everybody tends to forget about, add a when will I be satisfied to the goal? Because a number doesn't work for motivation. We've evolved to be social. I'm right back there. Motivation happens from person to person, not from person to number. And even if that person is yourself, you need to find when will you be satisfied. Still muted.
That is amazing. I think there is a really interesting thought in there around motivation happening from person to person and not person to number. And I've never thought about it like that. And I'm just wondering, I know I've talked to people about having an accountability buddy and other people that you can leverage. How do you coach folks? How do you really help them understand what will be meaningful to them? And how do you have them build a network or a support system around themselves to do that?
This is where it becomes important, again, that as a manager, you actually have your weekly, yes, that's the scientifically best cadence, one-on-one sessions with them, and you know a lot about them. Because different people get motivated by different things. On a very simple split on how human motivation works is approach versus avoidance. Some people want the carrot dangled in front of them. Some people, you can dangle that carrot all day long, nothing is going to happen. They do need to see that big chasm behind it that they can run away from. You need to know what type your report is. And then from there, people want to feel that they have an impact. If you're giving them a task and they don't know, if I fulfill that task, what does it actually do? There's no reason for them to get motivated by that, no matter if there's a carrot attached to it. I know in sales we have a very bad habit of, yay, we'll put a spiff up, or you get a bonus. And it works short term. But what you're actually doing in the long term is you're undermining the internal motivation. Because over time they will go, oh, I'm only doing this because I'm getting money for it. It's not meaningful anymore. And suddenly you see partially even your best performers plummet off on, they're not getting commissions anymore. So now you've also pulled off now even the external reason for why I should be motivated is gone. So what do you do at that point? That's where you really need to get back and talk to them. Find what for them personally might be motivating. Can you give them an approach goal for their personal development? This is important because you wanted that big bonus at the end of the year so you can send your kid to Disneyland or something like that. Find a personal reason, and also find a personal reason for you as the manager. If a manager can't explain why a task or role is personally important to them, they're point one in the wrong role. Point two, haven't thought about it themselves enough. Point three, should go to their own manager and talk it through with them.
That is so great, because I think this personal motivation is so much more of what drives us, so much more of what gives us the energy to sustain and avoid burnout. Because if we have a longer term goal, something that's much more personally meaningful, and we can get the feedback of we are on the right path to moving there, that's where we then have the ability to sustain and perform. And I love this thought of check in with yourself as the manager, as the leader. And if you don't have that personal goal, it's going to be really hard to go back to your earlier point of being that role model for your team. So as you think about the challenges you've seen in sales and the folks that you've seen that perform really well, what are some of those top qualities that really stand out to you for the sales leaders or leaders that you've had a chance to work with or learn from?
For leaders specifically, it might sound a little bit like a slogan, but I'll say the Curious Chameleon is probably best leader or manager I've ever seen, because curiosity is really what drives connection. We do like to say empathy drives connection. I'm actually not a big fan of empathy, believe it or not. It's a buzz term to me, and I have my issues, and I'm happy to talk about them. But for right now, curiosity is what gets a person to ask all those follow-up questions, to ask the open-ended questions, to not just use all that one-on-one time on, did you do the thing I asked you to do? Why are we having this meeting? We're going over numbers that could have been an email. We're both wasting time. A curious manager will not do that. The curious manager actually wants to hear all these little extra things that, yeah, I was late on that. Why? And then there's the family background that comes in, and the curious manager is going, oh, okay, I get it. Let's talk about that. And there's where the chameleon part comes in, because then they can approach a person. nearly like an actor. We've talked about mask in a bad way before, but here's where it becomes amazing. A person who is good at putting different parts of themselves forward at different times, at pulling those masks from their own heart, they can engage with anybody at that point without just mirroring them, but actually bringing something into the table, making it a group, giving it this entire trust. Because the chameleon is also willing to say, I get why you failed there. I did it too. That's the big thing you need from a manager, to be willing to take the first step, to not come at it from a hierarchical point of view, to build this one-on-one relationship on a peer basis, even if they are your boss.
Whoa, mind blown, because I'm a big proponent of empathy and love to talk to people about it, and can totally see where curiosity creates that authentic connection. And I'm not going to say I'm totally convinced yet that empathy is bad, and I don't think that's what you're saying, but I think this curiosity is what leads to true empathy and what gives us the ability to understand where someone else is coming from, not just from an assumption, but by actually asking why. But I've got to ask you, saying that you're not the hugest fan of talking about empathy. Give me a little bit more behind that. Give me a little bit more about where you see empathy falling short.
The biggest issue with empathy is that people don't understand that it comes in different flavors. To break it down on the two big facets of it is cognitive empathy and emotional empathy. Cognitive empathy is your capacity to take another person's perspective, to think yourself into their situation and take a look at the world from where they are standing. Emotional empathy is you are mirroring their emotions. The person is sad, you're sad. Now, cognitive empathy is incredibly important. And I do think it overlaps with curiosity, because if you're not curious, you're not going to do that entire exercise of looking at the world from their eyes. But we so often talk about emotional empathy and holding it up as this big example of now you can really understand a person. But mirroring is not what you need in all situations. Emotional empathy is the lowest bar that doesn't actually tell you if you care. That is compassion. Empathy only tells you, you are sad, I am sad. Compassion tells you, you are sad, I'm feeling caring towards you. I'm going to do something about it now.
This is really, really wonderful. A couple last questions for you.
Sure.
As we talked about mental health earlier, and I mentioned this story that a friend of mine shared on Instagram showing the difference in filters. And this doesn't totally relate to sales, but I think really aligns with our mental health. And this story showed somebody, a young woman with a filter over her skin, and then she removes it. And there are a bunch of different examples, but it blew my mind, and shot him a note that just said, wow, I can totally see why people struggle with mental health in today's day and age. And you've got a lot of interesting research on how do we as humans think about attraction, and how do we level set ourselves to an average. And so I'd love to share some of that insight that I think really makes it hard to thrive from a mental health perspective.
Mm-hmm. Oh, let me cheat here and actually pull it to sales, because attractiveness bias is actually a thing that is important in sales, because we do know that the more attractive the seller is, no matter the gender, the more likely they are to sell something. But how do we get to attraction? That is way more learned than a lot of people think. Now, there are some cross-cultural identifiers of what people see as beauty. We do know that no matter where you are, how you grew up, whatever, you want a certain degree of symmetry in the face, and you want a certain level of skin purity, because those are markers of health. And since we are all animals, healthy people are attractive. But apart from that, what do we find attractive is actually based on an averaging out effect that our brain runs fully subconsciously at all the time. So what happens when we look at so much media that uses filters, that uses editing, that does all these things to make people not look like people anymore? Our brain learns that as this is the range of actual living beings, and then it averages from there because we don't like extreme cases. So if you look at all of those overly beautiful people, the average suddenly becomes something that is nigh unattainable in real life. And then on top of that, here's where the diversity hammer comes down. We also build our idea of what is attractive based around race, because we do see so many white people in media that people of other skin colors and other face configurations, if we want to call it that, suddenly are outlier cases. Again, our brains do not like outlier cases. So if you live in an area where you only ever see one type of person, one race, one ethnicity, whatever exactly you want to call it, that is what your brain is going to perceive as normal and therefore attractive. Now, if you move to another place where the ethnicity is different, or if you consume a lot of media one way or another that shows you a different group of people, guess what? Your brain is going to change what you find attractive.
Wow. I think there is so much interesting insight behind that I'd never learned, never thought of, and makes a lot of sense when you start to unpack it and understand how we have been programmed for many, many years to operate in a certain way, to perceive the world in a certain way. And that obviously needs to change with, the majority of workers in the United States, Canada, experiencing burnout, teetering on that edge. We need to take some more conscious control of how we operate. And so what would your last piece of advice be for folks trying to sustain themselves more effectively as leaders and sales, as sellers? What would be the one or two things that you would do as an individual to set yourself up for the most success?
Oh, people are not going to like it. Take more breaks. It's the short and long of it. Our brains have evolved to go back and forth between two different states: focused attentions and what we call the default network. So unfocused attention, essentially. And we do know that the absolute maximum our brains can sustain on focused attention is 60 to 90 minutes. Now, let me be very clear here. That includes all kinds of distractions, essentially. The more there is, the shorter you do it. The harder the work is, the shorter you can do it. And from there, if you do not take the time to then get your brain over into default mode, you will not actually get the connections to previous experiences. So if you learn something new, have fun relearning it from scratch the next time. You will not make the social connections, so you cannot do any of the perspective taking that is so incredibly important in sales specifically. And you won't be able to make good future predictions, because how do you make future predictions? You base what you just experienced on you link it to things you experienced previous, to your knowledge, and then you go from there. Unless you take the break, you won't get there. And while we're on that whole break topic, I'm a big believer in meditation and motion. I know we do a ton of meditation talks these days. I'm going to confess, I'm really, really bad at it. I cannot sit still for it, but free walking, or in my case, dancing, is what helped me to get my brain exactly into that. Because the important part about meditation is to let your brain run, to do that whole default network that I've been talking about.
Oh, I love that, because I do find that so many people have this misconception that meditation needs to be sitting in a cave in India for days and months on end, or it has to be the 20 minutes or the 45 minutes sitting absolutely still. And so many teams and leaders and individuals that I work with on meditation have this misconception that makes it so hard to make it approachable. And so if we can actually come to this point of dancing gives me the ability to let my brain run free, movement, that's where I get to meditate. And for me lately, I've been taking my dog on walks and making sure that I'm not staring at my cell phone and really try and embrace the environment around me and notice the trees or the wind blowing or the birds chirping. That gives me that ability to hit that default mode network and lets my brain refresh and replenish. So I think that is a fantastic final thought for everybody. So take a break, take some deep breaths, know your mind is going to wander. And there are so many great nuggets that we've got of wisdom in here for managers, for leaders, for individuals, really trying to think about how can they avoid burnout? How can they set themselves up for success? And having some scientific study behind it is so much more powerful because we see the metrics and we see the data that let us know, but whatever we've been doing for the last while has not been working. And we need to change and we need something new. So Dr. Devan Kronisch, thank you so much for joining us on, for sharing your wisdom, your years of experience in academia and research, and now moving into this enablement realm that really is super exciting, hearing how you're bringing your unique perspective and spin on it to help us all sell better, grow better, and operate better as humans. So thank you.
Thank you again for having me, for letting me talk science to salespeople.
It's thanks to help from listeners like you, this podcast can continue to grow and help others. If you found anything helpful in today's episode, please take a second, share with a friend, and leave us a 5-star review on iTunes or wherever you get your podcast today. Thanks.